My name, as you hear, is Jeremy Cowan. I'm the editor and founder of the global IT and communications magazine and news portal M2M Now, which you can find at m2mnow.biz. End of advertisement. It's my privilege to be moderating this panel, and the good news is that I am all that stands between you and lunch. For the last 3.5 years, M2M Now has pretty much done what it says on the tin. We have been covering M2M globally and the Internet of Things as the development has evolved, as we have come to see more and more of what is meant by the Internet of Things. Even 4 years ago, it was a phrase that was scarcely used. In this session, we're going to continue this analysis by defining success in IT deployments, IoT deployments. Now, I'm a very positive person, but I do believe that to achieve IoT success, we need to know what IoT failure can look like. And so I wanted to share with you one real-world example of IoT failure. Now, I grant you this is extreme and perhaps atypical, but it serves to illustrate the potential risks before we go on to discuss the rewards and how you can achieve them. You just need to take the example from last year of TrendNet in the US. Last September, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, reached a settlement with TrendNet over its internet-connected secure view cameras, which turned out to be anything but secure. Some of their cameras and microphones supplied for applications ranging from home security to baby monitoring had firmware that allowed anyone who obtained the camera's IP address to access the live video feeds and the audio feed. And this only came to light when hackers posted live feeds on the web from almost 700 cameras. Now, my point isn't to try and embarrass this company any further. I'm certainly not trying to say that all IoT failures will be this costly or this public. I just want to point out to everyone how important this topic can be. Most IoT successes and failures will never make the headlines. Now, with that in mind, I wanted to introduce to you a very distinguished panel we have here. So let's give a warm welcome to our 4 panelists. And since we don't have your photos up there, gentlemen, I would ask you just to raise your hand as I introduce you. They are Thomas JAKOB, MD for Asia Pacific, Bosch Software Innovations Singapore, Marc BAKKER, who is Assistant Director, Marketing and Communications, Suntec Singapore Convention and Exhibition Centre, Derek Maggs, VP of Services Industries Asia Pacific Japan, SAP Singapore. And finally, and last but not least, Brian MULLOY, VP of App Labs, Apigee, USA. Gentlemen, it's often easy to identify failure, but not always so easy to spot the difference between a so-so project and a 5-star success. So that we're all on the same page, what are your benchmarks for success? I'm going to ask each of you in turn. Is it by profit margins and repeat business from the client, or how do you measure IoT success? Brian, can I start with you?
So when we founded our company, Apigee, we make money by selling expensive software to the global 2,000 companies, and our whole business model is built around ecosystems. So our quick answer would be we measure success by really healthy ecosystems.
Marc, could you tell us a little about how you benchmark this?
Yeah, sure. Suntec being a convention and exhibition center, we're more on the end user scale of the spectrum. And for us, it sounds deceptively simple, but it's incredibly hard to do, is we just wanted something that worked consistently. So we had a certain experience in mind that we wanted to deliver, and we just wanted that and nothing short of that would do.
Thomas, could you enlighten us?
Sure. As I mentioned before, for Bosch, the Internet of Things has a special significance as we are a producer of things, right? And we have been for a very long time. Now, what is for us at the moment most important is actually not so much the profitability, of course, that will ultimately come in, all these kind of things. But for us at the moment, the most important is to identify the use cases which provide benefit to the consumers of these services. And that is where we are at the moment focusing our energy on. Defining these use cases, understanding what they require, and then work backwards actually into the kind of capabilities which we need to develop as a company.
Derek.
Okay, from a SAP point of view, obviously we're a software company. I don't know whether our software is more or less expensive than my colleague here from Apigee, but we have a brand, and the brand is important. So you could take a short-term view that success was based on revenue, which is a clear, easy measure. But our brand is not built on that. Our brand is built on the success of our clients and helping them to run better. So this is, you know, each of our clients are very different. I work across 10 different industries, and in those industries we could be looking at, you know, votability on the public side, or we could be looking at profitability, or we could be looking at some infrastructure improvements for the client. So we work with the clients to define what success looks like, and it's a very different story every time I go to see a client.
That's an important point. I mean, we're not always talking about this being a sweetness and light and roses and honey. This is sometimes going to involve problems and challenges. What, from the experience that you've gained, Eric, would you say are the most commonly encountered problems and pitfalls that you need to steer your clients and your partners around?
Whew, there's a few. Obviously, we're at the early stages, and a number of the projects that we've done have been very innovative, and so that means that it has involved a large number of stakeholders within the client and also the ecosystem of maybe a telecoms provider, maybe some other people who provided some support to that function. But I do see that the expectation levels and what Thomas was saying in terms of establishing the use cases, that's in some respects quite easy to do. It doesn't take too much time to do that, then measuring the value for that. But I see then the execution of that is often limited by things like infrastructure, things like the devices, things like the lack of standards, or potentially the governance issues surrounding that, security issues that we've just been hearing about. So these are the sorts of things. But we've been involved in both what I would call proof of concepts with our clients, which have got to a stage where you now understand what are the next level of problems that you need to peel back. And we've also had some very successful use cases, which you heard my colleague Paul Marriott talking about a little bit earlier on.
Thomas, Derek has referenced the security aspect and standards becoming an increasing concern for people. Cisco just rightly referenced the constant catch-up element played by the standards bodies. It's only from what we see likely to become worse. Yet secure interoperability has to be a key element for IoT going forward. How do we as an industry try and square that circle?
Well, that's a very challenging question, I have to say, because I don't think there's one answer to that, and I don't think anybody has the answer at this point in time. It is by closely cooperating together, by realizing that these are issues which we need to address. We are putting a lot of emphasis at the moment on security. You can imagine there are millions and billions of Bosch devices out there, so to say. We cannot afford that anything happens, that people could hack into these or anything like that. So that's critically important. That is why we are working very closely with some of the market participants, whether it's SAP, whether it's Cisco, whether it's LG, from all walks of life, so to say, which are involved in that ecosystem, as well as system integrators, for example, also different sensor manufacturers. We are manufacturing sensors ourselves, but for us it's very important that this environment is open, that we are not focusing only on what we are doing, but that we are trying to build capabilities which can be taken advantage of by the majority of participants in that ecosystem. And so it requires continuous communication. It requires obviously the standards bodies to be involved, but I think it's most important that we all in the industry agree on what we want to achieve and that we come together and not build walled gardens, actually. We get a true network effect over here if we realize that only by working together we can make this work.
This is a question that may perhaps be particularly relevant to you. What's the position at Apigee on this?
By way of example, when General Motors launched the Chevy Volt in Shanghai, it was their first. So GM has had a connected car since 1997, a very long time. But when they launched the Chevy Volt in Shanghai in 2011, they were going to do something they had never done before, which was essentially use standard-based HTTP protocols, just normal web protocols, to access the vehicle from a smartphone. So from the perspective of the CIO of OnStar, which is their telematics unit, he viewed every GM vehicle as a potential missile on the road. So Apigee, our background, our heritage, our DNA is from the pure web world, where we've dealt with some of the security and the trust issues, where you want to, real simple example, you want to let your Instagram photos show up on Facebook, right? I own that data as the user, but I give these guys permission to talk to one another. So we've figured out that part of it, but we hadn't accounted for the physical safety. So in our heritage, and so when we worked with GM, the number one thing that they were concerned about was the CNN moment. And the CNN moment is they wake up in the morning on their way to go to the office, and CNN is talking about somebody hijacking a Chevy Volt and running it into something really dangerous. So I think there's a really interesting, this might be a little bit of a segue, almost like an interesting culture clash that's going to happen here. Companies like Bosch and General Motors and folks in the telco, their real strong software heritage is around embedded systems engineers, where they don't even like to think of themselves as software guys, right? They're trained in electrical engineering or vehicle engineering or telecommunication engineering, and they're very, very, very critical about working in a constrained environment and thinking about physical safety. Now, that's the things part of the Internet of Things. The Internet part of the Internet of Things are people like us who are used to, when you're going to start your business model, assume unlimited bandwidth, unlimited data storage, no concerns about physical safety. So we see this big culture clash that'll be setting up here to figure out how those two cultures are going to work together. And I think just like when two forms of music collide, like German harmonies with African syncopation, then we get jazz. I think we're on the verge of something like that, where we're going to see a new type of development culture emerge.
Marc, talking of cultures, this is where an industry where so many different cultures can collide from different software, hardware, integration angles. And you are the end customer. And sometimes I wonder whether or not the end customer gets caught up in a culture clash. I'm not asking you about any particular culture clashes you might have experienced, but I would love to know whether or not this is something that concerned you at the outset, whether or not you felt that the stakeholders all brought the same requirements and the same expectation and objectives to your project. Was that something that concerned you at the outset, and were you similarly concerned once it had been completed?
Well, absolutely. I think we...
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
We may have underestimated the complexity of what we were asking when we got started on this. So as some of you may know, we have just completed a massive renovation. We spent over $180 million just taking a center that was built almost 20 years ago and turning it into something new. And they really started with just a bunch of ideas of what they wanted that to look like. So it was really just purely, what does a convention center of the future look like? Knowing what we know now, knowing what the new technologies are, how would we build that? They didn't give any thought as to how were we going to pull this off. And once we started looking around for partners, we realized there are a lot of people that do things incredibly well. They are very specialized. They've been doing it for a long, long time. The thing that was harder to find is people who could play well with others. Because I don't think there's a single thing that we've put into the center that we are using exactly as intended. We're doing all kinds of crazy stuff with systems that had very clear specs. And the first challenge was finding companies that were willing to go like, well, we don't really do that, but let's see what happens if we try. And it's not just a question of finding the companies, but it's a question of finding the right individuals within those companies who kind of have the vision and the courage to go, well, let's just see what happens, and who are then also willing to make themselves vulnerable, sometimes to competitors, when they're trying to figure out a problem.
It really is that granular.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it comes down to which wire goes where and what message gets sent to this thing. And if this guy doesn't understand that guy, then where's the constraint?
Yeah.
And how do you get around it? So you really go into a lot of detail to ultimately get it to work.
Derek, does this have echoes for you? I'd love to know if this is familiar territory.
Yeah, you could probably see me nodding there like a dipping dally, but yes, absolutely. And finding the right partners is a very important part of this. I think sometimes, and our software will work very well, but you're constrained either by the access to the data, the quality of the data, or there's some physical constraint on the data. So, just as an example, we talked to a large port in the region, and they'd like to be able to do things better with the trucks and the rubber devices, rubber vehicles that they have within the port, and they'd like to be able to organize them better and save money and so on. But they have difficulty talking to all those devices, because if you've ever wandered around a port, and I don't recommend it without a hard hat, you've got large stacks of containers, and it's not very easy to see these devices. They disappear for long periods of time, and a driver could be off having a cup of coffee or a smoke or doing something, and it's not necessarily the most efficient place in the world. So new technology is needed, and then you say, well, who are the partners we can reach out to that? So we've been working with a partner, for instance, in this case called VanillaPlus, and they've got a way of linking a sort of meshed network using the sorts of devices that have been put in cars using the IEEE 802.11p protocol, and that will enable vehicles to triangulate with each other as a mesh and then connect back, and that's a way of solving a problem. But sometimes you have to go out and find those partners who can solve specific problems or have specific intellectual property before you can then take the next major leap forward that I was talking about. There's one of the constraints. But
We don't have a great deal of time, and I'm conscious of everyone's hunger. But Thomas, I'd love to know how IoT partner ecosystems are learning to handle these differing interests. This must be a learning process for everybody.
Well, it certainly is. As I mentioned before, we are working on some projects where there are a large number of participants involved, right? There are people who are supplying the sensors, actually. There are people who are providing the legacy systems, because, as I think the colleague from Intel also mentioned, we are most of the times not talking about greenfields, right? We're talking about areas where we have lots of legacy systems involved, where we have to interface with many different parties, actually. And where not always necessarily the understanding is even still there, what has been done at that time. And on top of that, we are obviously having various integrators and so on, which are coming in, as well as consultants, right? So it's a very varied ecosystem there we need to deal with. And honestly, there is no magic formula also here. I don't think that anybody has that. At least we didn't have it yet. We are learning as we go along. And we find, depending, and I think, Marc, what you mentioned is very, very true, actually. It's not only the question of who is the partner, but who is the person, actually, on the other side, who will make it work, actually, who is willing to lean a little bit more than others out of the window, actually, come to the table and actually do something which maybe is not that conventional, actually, at this point in time. And so in terms of structure, we are trying to be also there as open as possible, bring everybody to the table, try to be less concerned about what information we share. That's another big topic very often. And try to make the things work in the interest of the customer normally, and that should be the angle, and I think you mentioned that also before, the angle from which we are looking at, trying to protect, and that has been a big thing also for Bosch in the past, protecting your intellectual property. Yes, that is important when you produce millions of the devices, but when you try to develop solutions, you probably also there have to become a little bit more open to other ideas and to maybe share a little bit more also. And that is also even on the open source community. That's another important aspect, which we are also dabbling in now and trying to understand how actually our software solutions can be more exposed in the open source community also, because I don't think we can do it on our own actually either.
I think that's a fantastic topic and one that could take us well until tomorrow. So I'm going to give you 15 to 20 seconds each on this last area. I'm going to start with the end user here, Marc. As the recipient of an ecosystem, would you say that partner ecosystems have a long-term viable future? Or are we looking at a scenario in which it will be preferable for you to be dealing with one key player, as the old phrase has it, one throat to choke?
I think that given the complexity of what we need to do, it's impossible to find one person that would be able to do all of that. So you definitely need to work with partners. But I think two things are really critical. One is make absolutely sure that the areas of responsibility are well defined so that you know whose throat to choke. And the other thing is just to get people to be more open and willing to share, especially when it comes to data.
Thank you. Brian.
My favorite ecosystem story just happened this week, actually. So Nike is one of our clients, and we worked with them early on to develop the infrastructure behind the Nike Fuel Band. So headlines 2 days ago, Nike fires the Fuel Band team. Nike is out of the hardware business. So my email lights up with all of our sales reps around the world saying, oh no, now how do we talk about Internet of Things, like the wearable computing use case is gone, what do we do? So the headline could have easily read, Nike triumphantly enters the platform business. Because what they did is they set up an incubator in San Francisco called Fuel Labs. And Fuel Labs, the idea is they will invite innovative hardware entrepreneurs into the lab who will use the Nike API in order to create interesting hardware innovations. So if you were a hardware vendor sort of on the sidelines, are you more comfortable now that Nike's out of the hardware business? Or were you more comfortable before? Clearly you're more comfortable now because the giant isn't going to kind of step on your toes, which is always a huge ecosystem issue when you have a big guy at the center. So okay. I think my answer is I think the ecosystems have a very long future, and the bigger the company is, I think the sooner they recognize that they're a data company first, followed by a software company second, maybe followed by a hardware company third, the better that will be.
Thomas, quickly, 15 seconds if you would, on
Sure.
the future of an ecosystem.
The ecosystem from our point of view will be extremely varied. There will be thousands, there will be 10,000s of participants. There will be certain areas where we will see consolidation. We will see probably a smaller number of platforms because it is important that we share information across multiple domains. So we believe there will be some kind of a limited number of brains, as the mayor called it this morning. There will be a consolidation in general purpose sensors, for example, because net significant economies of scope and scale effects are playing a role there, but there will be lots of other participants which will provide specific apps, specific plugins, specific purpose sensors and components, which will make that an extremely interesting and very lively ecosystem from our point of view.
Thank you, Thomas. And finally, Derek.
Yeah. Well, from SAP's side, there are going to be a few key partners that are going to remain for a very long time, I'm sure, including the likes of Cisco and other providers. But when we look at it from our customers' point of view, we be foolish to think that we'd be the only sole source of partner that they would want to work with. There's going to be a lot of players. There's so many different industries, and there's value to be driven through this IoT. If you're looking at that 19 billion just in the next few years, which will be before I retire, then you've got to realize that can't be done by a small number of companies. So I agree with exactly what Thomas is saying. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you all, and I'm sorry that this has had to be so brief, but it's been fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving your thanks to this panel.